You're watching SNN, the Suncoast News Network.
Welcome back. I'm Marco Lamano. Former Governor Rick Scott moved the needle. He was a different style of governor, and he had huge Republican majorities at his side. Despite that, he faced resistance from Republicans in government and couldn't always get what he wanted. In our next installment of Red, Purple, and Blue, a sea change in Florida politics, we look at what Scott couldn't do and the culmination of the seeds of the political Tea Party with the 2016 presidential election. Rick Scott was a two-term governor, winning close elections in 2010 and in 2014 when Republican turned Democrat and former Governor Charlie Crist ran against him. Republican majorities expanded in the legislature under Scott's watch. Yet he didn't get everything he wanted.
Oftentimes what will happen is if you're in a one-party state, you'll still have little fractions that kind of break off, and they kind of war a little bit with each other over things within a majority party. And that happened a ton during the Rick Scott era.
One such moment was 2013. After launching his original campaign for governor on opposing President Obama's Affordable Care Act, Scott came out in favor of expanding Medicaid in Florida under the ACA. A Florida Senate committee rejected the idea on a party-line vote. Scott would reverse course and oppose Medicaid expansion again by 2015.
He had to spend the first few years, there was a lot of combat between him and the legislature because he didn't have those relationships. And so he had to create them. During his last year of his first term and in the last 4 years of his second term, that there was more relationship and interaction between the legislature and Rick.
In 2018, after the school shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High, Scott signed a bill that enhanced gun control laws and raised the minimum age to purchase firearms to 21, a bipartisan win. In fact, despite Democrats to this day longing to finally defeat Scott, the then governor did garner some respect from Democratic officials.
I've heard from so many of our mayors and elected leaders across the state that Rick also, behind closed doors, made those phone calls to Democratic leaders across the state. That he would make sure that if there's something going on in a county, if there was a hurricane coming, if there was a natural disaster, he'd go into those counties and actually work with the local electeds. He was still big on home rule.
Scott would run for Senate in 2018 against Democratic U.S. Senator Bill Nelson, who had been in office since 2000. And once again, Scott just barely won. Scott spent large amounts of money, and Nelson's campaign was inefficient.
I spoke with folks that were doing some work for the Nelson campaign, high up in the Nelson campaign, and they had been with him for 30, 40 years, right? Like, he didn't have the youngest, most vigorous staff, and they maybe made some choices and campaigning that maybe a younger, more plugged in, more evolved staff may have made.
Before this, and near the end of his 2 terms, the seeds of the Tea Party wave that rode Scott into office in 2010 would culminate in the presidential election.
I am your voice.
Despite being a Manhattan businessman, Donald Trump ran a populist campaign in 2016, railing against what he called a corrupt system, with a call to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C.
Trump changed the game completely and tapped into something that was always there, but maybe never fully explored within the party.
Guys like me, consultants like me, we had gone out and built a monster. And every 2 or 4 years, we took the monster out of the closet, we took it to the voting booth and said, vote, vote, poked it with a stick, vote, and it would vote. And then Trump broke the lock off the cabinet, let the monster out.
This push toward white, non-college educated folks and feeling like they're being left behind. Florida has cities by the beach and all that stuff. That's true. But you get a couple zip codes inland a little bit and it looks very different. There's a lot of old Florida here.
By pledging to make America great again, Trump attracted the old Florida that voted for Reuben Askew and Lawton Chiles decades earlier.
And with that push to kind of harken back to days gone by, that fits really well with that base of voters, generally speaking.
Democrat Hillary Clinton's historic turnout had her surpass even Obama's votes in both of his Florida wins. But Trump still topped her in Florida in the 2016 presidential election.
In 22, you can look back and you can say, oh, yeah, this is kind of the beginning of that, right? We're starting to see the Republican Party shift a little bit, becoming more populist and bringing in some of those folks.
Some of that would be seen in the next big election in 2018, with the closest gubernatorial election in Florida's history, and one Democrat who would stop the party from being shut out statewide. By the time of the 2018 governor's race, Florida had trended Republican for a few decades, but after being shut out of the governor's mansions for 20 years, Florida Democrats finally had all the excitement in the world behind their backs. In our next installment of Red, Purple, and Blue, a sea change in Florida politics, we'll dive into the closest governor's race in Florida's history and the Democratic resurgence that wasn't to be. Catch the next part of this series and all parts every Sunday at 6 and 10 p.m. right here on SNN. You can also watch all the episodes you missed on SNNTV.com. Just hover over news on the top of the page and click politics.